sure, it would be great if we had nations that were peaceful and could come together and cooperate and do something positive for the planet. But at the end of the day, when you put together nations like the United States, China, Russia, some of these other nations that are involved in the UN that are authoritarian nations and have shown that they really do not have a true care for human life, I don't think you're going to throw all those institutions together with this technocratic worldview into a blender and pump out a peaceful world government.
Hello, I'm Zahra Sethna, and I'm happy to welcome you to another episode of the Collapse Life podcast. Today, we're pleased to welcome a man who's empowering others to reduce government and corporate influence on their lives and create local independence. And there's perhaps no greater threat to our independence than the United Nations and its upcoming Pact for the Future. If these are the kinds of topics you want to see more of, please subscribe to this channel now. As a journalist and author, Derrick Broze has been looking at a range of issues related to freedom and liberty, and he's here today to tell us more about the origins of the UN's Pact and how it fits with the broader agenda for global governance. Derrick, welcome to Collapse Life.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
We're so happy to be having this conversation because it's very timely. The UN is currently in preparations for its 79th General Assembly. And on the side of that, it will be hosting what it's calling the Summit of the Future at the end of September. And these kinds of events, these General Assemblies and summits, they happen every year. And largely, most people don't notice them. But there's something unique about this year's summit. And so that's what we kind of wanted to have you talk about. Your reporting has uncovered the fact that member states are about to declare a planetary emergency as part of their so-called Pact for the Future, which they're going to adopt at the summit. So we wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about what you've uncovered and what you think are the true motivations behind the pact.
Absolutely. Thank you for making time for this really important topic, because I've noticed that there's not so many people in the media in general. We could include mainstream corporate media as well as independent media who are really aware of this topic. I first became aware of it, I think, about a year and a half ago. I track what the UN's up to in general and organizations like the World Economic Forum, just trying to keep an eye on them. And there was something actually a couple of years ago called Our Common Agenda that the United Nations had put together at the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, after Secretary General Antonio Guterres basically said, we're falling behind the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, and we need to rally the troops, so to speak, and figure out how are we going to make sure that we can accomplish all that they intend to accomplish by 2030. And from my perspective and my reading of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, they are very much anti-liberty and anti-independence, whether that's on the individual level or on the national level. And so this really does go back quite a few years, really to 2020 and COVID and everything else. But from Our Common Agenda, that led to things like the Sustainable Development Summit last September, the SDG Summit, and then that led to where we're coming up now in just about 4 or 5 weeks, the Summit of the Future, and as you mentioned, the Pact for the Future. So this has really been kind of building up to this point. And despite the lack of media coverage within the UN themselves and within their they often have these virtual roundtables and they're meeting throughout the week, and most people are not really tuned in or paying any attention. They're definitely championing this as the big moment to, they've talked about remaking the UN into UN 2.0, giving the United Nations more powers. And as you mentioned, the Pact for the Future, and we can get deeper in all that. But I do think more people should be aware of this. It is coming up September 22nd to the 23rd in New York City, as you mentioned, as part of the General Assembly. They're also going to be doing what they're calling action days. And at the same time as this is going on, we also are going to have the World Economic Forum will be in New York City as well for what they're calling the Sustainable Development Impact meetings. And then another organization that's kind of tied into all this, the Club of Rome, is also going to be meeting at the same time. So there's definitely going to be this convergence of internationalist, globalist, whatever words you'd like to use, organizations that I don't think every member, every person involved really understands the true purpose, but at the higher levels, and when you really get into kind of deciphering the words that they use, because they do like to use buzzwords like sustainability, diversity, equity, decentralization even, and topics that for the average person might sound very appealing or interesting. When you dig past those flowery buzzwords, you can actually see that some of the intentions are, as I mentioned, about relinquishing national sovereignty and
Mhm.
then, of course, individual sovereignty in favor of having the UN step even more into this role as essentially a world government.
Exactly. Yeah, we are on the exact same wavelength here at Collapse Life, and that's why we definitely wanted to have this conversation with you now because, as you say, I think a lot of people just don't know, and everything sounds so anodyne. It sounds fine, and global governance, cooperation is a word that they like to use a lot, and I think it's hard to argue. I mean, of course, countries should cooperate, shouldn't they? But what they really mean is, as you suggested, a sort of a one world government that strips away the sovereignty, the national constitutions, the democratic vote from all of those countries that are participating or cooperating. So let's get into some of the details. So I think there is a draft circulating of what this Pact for the Future contains, and I think you've seen it. So talk a little bit about what some of those phrases are and what they actually mean.
Sure. So we saw the zero draft report. I think it was back in February, March, April, around then. And then there has been the first version that was released in July. I haven't checked in the last few days if the second or the final version has been released publicly yet, but I know in the coming weeks we're likely to see it. It's important for people to understand that every single member state of the United Nations is planning on signing this so far. I did go back and watched a number of different, as I mentioned, these virtual meetings and these discussions, these debates. And there have been some dialogue with mainly, I would say, so called developing nations, third world nations, African nations, particularly South American nations. I know Cuba was one of them that are kind of pushing back, and maybe not for the same reasons that we might push back, but in terms of just feeling like their voices aren't being heard. And again, that's another topic that's people aren't hearing about, that if they're hearing anything about this summit of the future, it's that it's this amazing thing and the world is finally coming together and we've realized that we're falling behind the climate change goals, and so it's time to make it happen. But in reality, there definitely do appear to be some countries who have pushed back and said things like our voices are being ignored. But still, despite that, it appears to be on track to get all 193, I believe, member states of the United Nations to sign on to the Pact for the Future at the Summit of the Future. So the draft versions that we've seen, I think the most worrisome aspect, because again, the vast majority of it does have these, paying lip service to sustainability and regenerative agriculture and paying attention to indigenous people. And we're going to make sure women's voices are heard and children are not suffering poverty, things that most of us would support. Um, and maybe even some of those things might potentially happen, but at what cost, I think, is the question we have to ask. At what cost will these alleged, benevolent goals come forward?
Mhm.
Now, to me, the most worrisome aspect of the Pact for the Future of the versions that we've seen is something related to the planetary emergency. So there have been discussions by member states of the UN, as well as organizations like the Club of Rome, which we'll talk more about, calling for the declaration of a planetary emergency. And this is because for the last few years, the United Nations, as well as the World Economic Forum, have been saying that we are entering into a polycrisis or multi-crisis, this idea that pandemics, war, climate change, financial calamity, etc., these different claimed emergencies are all kind of converging into one polycrisis that now must be dealt with. And again, along with that messaging is the idea that it's too big for any one individual nation to handle these crises. So thus we must, bring everybody together in the UN, try to re-empower the UN. And so this discussion on declaring a planetary emergency, I think, is really what worries me. Now, I don't know for certain if that is going to happen at the Summit of the Future, but they're absolutely talking about it. And even if they don't particularly specifically say we declare a planetary emergency, all the world, the governments of the world, et cetera, they are for sure, without a doubt, including what they're calling an emergency platform within the draft versions of the Pact for the Future. And I believe it'll be in the final version as well. And so this emergency platform is basically the mechanism that they could use to grab more powers, to reduce sovereignty from individual nation states, much like people were afraid of the pandemic agreement, the pandemic treaty with the World Health Organization
Right.
back in May. And over the last year or two, there's been a lot of movement around that, people rallying against it, people paying attention. Well, unfortunately, once May passed and most people sort of thought like we beat it, it didn't happen. They didn't sign the agreement. Some of that same energy and that same intention is within this pact for the future. It's this very similar in terms of if the United Nations declares an emergency based on any number of incidents, and in their language, it's pretty vague. They say things like an emergency that shocks multiple regions of the world.
Mhm.
And so obviously that could be interpreted. You could drive a bus through that and you could interpret that however you like. But if in the event of a shock that impacts multiple regions of the world, then they could call upon this emergency platform, which would give the UN more powers to act in whatever way they believe is appropriate. Now, one thing I will mention that I do think it's interesting that in the draft versions, the UN themselves, and I think this is probably because of some pressure. I wouldn't say there's a lot of public pressure. Again, most people don't even know, but some pressure from the various nations who've said, hey, we're concerned about this, our voices are being ignored. And again, when it came to the WHO treaty, there were some nations that did stand up and say, we're worried this is going to erode our national sovereignty. And you even had Tedros of the WHO having to make public statements calling that conspiracy theories. So I think because of that, when it comes to the language with the emergency platform, they've actually included a few lines that say something to the effect of, this will not be a standing body, this will not be a standing institution, referring to the emergency platform, and even specifically saying it will not impact national sovereignty. Now, we could take the UN for their word and believe them that's what they intend to mean. Personally, I believe that they're trying to get ahead of fears and concerns, and again, because of the pushback with the WHO treaty, they're kind of putting that language in there. I don't think we should rest on their word and assume that at the end those words are going to be held to and that they're going to hold to their statements. But yes, they are at least paying lip service to national sovereignty and claiming that the emergency platform will not be a standing institution, will just be called upon in the event of this alleged emergency. And then from there, the UN could do various things. And again, some of it, they don't really even outline what exactly that could be. I think they're purposely keeping it vague, but
Right.
the general sentiment is that it would give the UN more powers to act. And this could be in terms of financing, like let's say they claim there was like right now we're hearing about monkeypox in Africa.
Mhm.
If the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future had already been signed, perhaps this would be something that they say, okay, this fits the bill. We're going to initiate this emergency platform. And then they start injecting lots of money over there for vaccines or whatever, because I can talk more about this in a moment, but the financial aspect is definitely a huge piece of this for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so people may not know much about the Sustainable Development Goals and its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, but it is this sort of recurring process that the UN goes through, and all the member states come and have one of these big fanfare meetings. And then it inevitably goes the way this one did, which is, we're not meeting our goals. We're rolling back in some areas. We've had some small successes in certain regions, but others are falling behind. So, how is this going to be any different? Does this Pact for the Future just become the new SDGs, or is there something different about it?
I do think it's different. You're correct that in the early 2000s they had the Millennium Development Goals, and in 2015 this became the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And much of what the UN discusses, they talk about the need to, they have set some goals for like let's get to net zero by 2050 and some of these other sorts of things. But by and large, their focus has been on 2030 now for at least the last since 2015. And Gutierrez, the head of the UN, I've written several articles talking about how for the last couple of years he's put out statements essentially just lamenting that we're going to fall short. I personally believe that this is sort of like almost a psychological operation to sort of like get the people who are very much whatever people's thoughts on climate change, the people who think the world's about to end because of
Mhm.
climate change, to seed it into their mind that we're not doing enough and we need to race faster. And this, I believe, would then justify whatever extreme actions the UN might take after the Summit of the Future and going forward. Because again, we're here in late August 2024, so you've got about 6 years left to try to meet these Agenda 2030 goals. And you could also add to that at the beginning of 2020, the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, they did partner together, and they called this the decade of transformation, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They also came and were involved in that, said that this is going to be the decade of transformation and where we will race towards accomplishing these goals. I believe that the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future is just meant to kind of inject some more energy into the 2030 goals that they're pushing. I don't think that it means it'll be inconsequential and it's just going to be another, UN thing. There is the potential for that. I mean, let's be real. The UN has annual meetings and they have meetings multiple times a year, and most people pay no attention to them, I think, to our detriment. And so it's not like a brand new thing. And again, they have a General Assembly every year, but the way that they are treating this, the way they are communicating about this is that the Summit of the Future presents this once in a lifetime opportunity, much like we heard during COVID, that, there's these crises that we need to take advantage of. And this discussion of the planetary emergency, I think, is really the most worrisome aspect. So the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, those have been existing. I don't think those are going to go anywhere. But as I mentioned, a big part of this is financial. So they talk about in the Pact for the Future and in the discussions around the Summit of the Future that we need new financial instruments. And I actually have been covering this for a couple of years now. There was a meeting last year, or is it maybe in 2022 or 2023 in France. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was another, world government summit like this. And Macron had invited Biden and all these different world leaders there, as well as some of the big banks. And they weren't discussing the Summit of the Future yet, but they were saying we need to create new financial instruments, green financial instruments to fund this transition. So they're essentially calling for not only for the nation states to put more money into this, but they're working with private actors like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as some others, to try to inject as much money into this. And I definitely believe, based on what I've seen, that there is probably some funny money business going on in there. As we see with many philanthropic outfits, they're able to put their private money into their outfits and then claim they're doing all these great things for the world, while they're also profiting and then pushing their agendas as well. So I believe that's what we're going to witness. But definitely there may be a discussion at the Summit of the Future about some new financial system, because multiple times, both at the meeting and in France and in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, we've heard these folks discuss that we need a new Bretton Woods moment. And of course, Bretton Woods was the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. And so they are absolutely talking about trying to create new globalist institutions. And that could just be an upgrade to the old ones, the IMF, the World Bank, or it could be something new, because the other worrisome aspect is they keep mentioning UN 2.0. That it's time for us to have a second version, an updated version. We did the UN back in the post World War II, and it was fit for its purpose at that time. But now we need to update, we need to upgrade for the 21st century. And what does that mean exactly? We don't exactly know, but I do believe it will involve this. They might launch some, new version of the IMF, some new financial instruments to try to fund their projects here. And then, of course, as we've already talked about, this potential planetary emergency. But for sure, they are treating this like this is a once in a lifetime opportunity that they do not want to let pass up. And unfortunately, most people have no idea it's even happening.
Right. And for those of us who have even the slightest bit of information about this, the talk of reforming the UN sounds like a good thing. It sounds like, that's, it's a 75-year-old behemoth, and it definitely does need some reform. I mean, I think you and I probably think it needs to be torn down, but their version of reform is a little different. But actually, that UN 2.0 could mean completely taking apart the checks and balances that were put in place 75, 80 years ago,
Absolutely.
and just turning that into this one world government that we really should not be favoring at all.
Absolutely. And I think, just to take it a little deeper, that this is because, for folks who are not familiar with the political philosophy of technocracy, it is actually the guiding philosophy behind the United Nations from the beginning of it. And of course, if you know the history of the United Nations and the founding of it in New York City with support from David Rockefeller and other shady folks that have been around for quite some time, the technocratic belief system is essentially that we can't trust politicians, which I tend to believe, but they go a little further. They said we can't trust politicians. We can't even trust the people. So there shouldn't be voting. There shouldn't be constitutional republics or democracy. We shouldn't have business people, the capitalist class, et cetera, running things. Instead, it should be the technocrats, which they defined as the scientific experts, the technological experts, the technological elite. And when you go back to really understand the founding of the technocracy movement, which was popular in the United States and Canada in the 20s and 30s up till the 40s a little bit, and it seemed to kind of fade away, but it definitely appears to continue to be the guiding philosophy. And I'll
Mhm.
point to now deceased Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a big player in U.S. politics and really world politics. And he wrote a book called America Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era. He called it Technotronic rather than Technocratic, but essentially he described the same thing. He described, the need to give up individual liberty and individual privacy in the name of this utopia that they promise, and using institutions like the United Nations. The technocrats called it a technate, and they said it would be run by the technocrat king and things of this sort. But it's essentially the belief that we're not smart enough to know what to do with our own lives. And again, that the crises are so big at this point that they require a certain level of giving up our liberties and giving up national sovereignty in order to save the planet, allegedly, is what they claim. Now, of course, I'm of the belief that what is really behind this is a eugenics agenda. But I think ultimately that's what people need to understand, is that this is a technocratic worldview, that they don't believe you have the smarts within yourself to take care of your own life. And of course, they've convinced many people in the world that the world is only a few years away from becoming a boiling planet that we can't live on. And we've got external threats, maybe from space, and now we've got pandemics and financial calamity and war and whatever it is, and all these problems are too big that any individual nation state cannot handle on their own. And now, in an ideal world, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, sure, it would be great if we had nations that were peaceful and could come together and cooperate and do something positive for the planet. But at the end of the day, when you put together nations like the United States, China, Russia, some of these other nations that are involved in the UN that are authoritarian nations and have shown that they really do not have a true care for human life, I don't think you're going to throw all those institutions together with this technocratic worldview into a blender and pump out a peaceful world government.
Right. No, and that whole idea of technocracy is no longer some sort of far off dystopian future. I mean, if anyone needs an example, just think about COVID and Dr. Anthony
Absolutely.
Fauci saying, "I am the science." And then
Trust
shortly
the
after that,
experts.
exactly, there was a UN official, I think, at the World Economic Forum saying, "We own the science."
We're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world, should know it.
We being the
Yeah.
United Nations, right? The Prime Minister of New Zealand said, "We are the truth." Right? These are the technocrats who think that you're not smart enough to run your own life. So yeah, just I think that's a really important point to make, which links to my next question, which is you mentioned the Club of Rome. Tell
Yeah.
people what is that and why we should care.
Yeah, the Club of Rome is definitely an important piece of this puzzle. And again, they are one of the groups that have kind of been able to lurk more in the shadows. Most people are familiar with the World Economic Forum. I think that they have become the kind of public face for the technocrats. Obviously, most people know Klaus Schwab. We know when the World Economic Forum meets. But as you get a little bit higher up, what I call the pyramid of power, there are other groups that seem to represent these same interests that are a little bit more secretive. So we could point to groups like the Bilderberg Group, which we don't even know if that's their real name. That's just the nickname they've been given because in 1954, they started meeting at the Bilderberg Hotel. And they've been now meeting every year around May or June in different locations around the world. And you get people from, some people that go to the World Economic Forum, but even it seems a little bit more elite than that. You get academics and politicians and nonprofits, think tanks, philanthropists, outlets, Bill Gates and others like that have come over the years, but they have been forced, the Bilderberg Group has been forced to become more public in the last 10 to 15 years. If you go back 20 years, really to the beginning of the kind of internet and social media, there were people who were paying attention to this, but they were still being called conspiracy theorists. Nowadays, the Bilderberg Group has a website. They'll post a very vague kind of list of their topics they're claiming they're talking about, and they will post a public list of attendees. That is all brand new. And the Bilderberg Group, as I said, is, I think, a little more secretive. And you have organizations like the Club of Rome, who also have a website. They exist, but far less people know about them.
Yeah.
And there's quite a bit of overlap between these three groups, because you can go back to the early days of the World Economic Forum in the 1970s, and some of the members of the Club of Rome were there. They were basically helping them found the World Economic Forum. And then again, some of the same folks involved in the Club of Rome have been attendees of the Bilderberg Group since the very beginning. The Club of Rome, it describes itself as, an environmental nonprofit, a think tank, highly focused on climate change at the moment. But their agenda has evolved and changed over the years. Back in the 70s and 80s, when it was popular to say that we were about to hit an overpopulation boom, they were warning about that. Them and their members have been wrong multiple times about the apparent crises we're about to fall into, and that by 2000, everybody's going to be homeless and on the streets, and people are going to be dying everywhere. They've made numerous predictions. Essentially, what the Club of Rome is, though, is an organization that believes, much like the UN and the technocrats we're talking about, that people are not smart enough to know how to manage the world. And in fact, the Club of Rome, this is really where that eugenics agenda comes from.
Right.
You can look up an individual, Dennis Meadows, who's a member of the Club of Rome. He's spoken openly about the need to reduce the world's population in order to put it back in balance, allegedly. And the Club of Rome also is infamous for the report, The Limits to Growth. They have a couple that are kind of infamous for some of the statements they've made. And the Club of Rome continues to this day to say that their reports, Limits to Growth, were taken out of context. But essentially, if you go back to this report, as well as some others, they specifically say that them and their members decided that the environment, climate crisis, et cetera, would be the way to push their agenda. And even in their own words, they say, we then decided that humanity itself is the enemy. And that's ultimately been their message. Now, again, they've put out statements claiming people are misinterpreting them. I've run through and read the whole book and the different reports they've put out, and I don't think there's really any way to gloss over what they're truly saying. They point to environmental calamities. They basically notice, much like with pandemics. I did some reporting back then during the COVID times on, not to sidetrack too much, but just to hammer the point home. I did some reporting on something called parasite stress theory, and there's multiple studies about this going back to the 70s, including folks funding this connected to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they found out that things like pandemics and the fear of pandemics actually registers higher with humans in terms of fear than anything else, war, famine, etc. And these studies even say, even if the fear of a pandemic isn't real, it can have this really unique response in human beings that it makes people become more obedient and things of that sort. So these folks have been studying human psychology for generations, and they know what makes us tick. They know what makes us afraid. And then, of course, when you can link the climate narrative with the pandemic narrative, which is what we've seen the last couple of years, that, we're going to have more and more pandemics because of climate change, and it's causing old viruses to be released as the ice melts and things like this. They're really linking all these different agendas together, and the Club of Rome is one of the groups behind it. And we don't know as much about their full membership, because I'll just mention this is a little thread that I've been trying to learn more about over the years. But there are people who have done some good work, like Vandana Shiva, who, if you go back to the 90s, she's listed as a member of the Club of Rome. I don't know if she still is a member, or if she maybe woke up, because she seems the last few years like she's been pretty consistent with her message. But just as an example, that over the years, the Club of Rome has existed, and they may have kind of roped in some good people who don't really fully understand the agenda, much like the UN and the World Economic Forum does. Obviously, every person that goes there to speak isn't necessarily a part of the agenda per se. But a lot of good, well-intentioned people get pulled into these agendas. They're just focused on their little, part of the puzzle, not realizing the larger picture here. Last thing I'll mention about the Club of Rome, it is actually the Club of Rome that is behind this talk for the planetary emergency. The Club of Rome put out a report in 2019. It was the earliest version I could find. There may have been earlier calls, but in 2019, a year before COVID, they put out a report talking about the need for a calling for a planetary emergency. And then once the whole COVID, crisis began, they updated the report and basically said, look, see, this is exactly what we're talking about. Now we've got pandemics. And so you can trace the current Summit of the Future, Pact for the Future, calls for a planetary emergency back to groups like the Club of Rome. And there's others as well, but I think that they're definitely a major player in this whole push.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, Another group that I think probably doesn't get enough attention outside of maybe economic circles is the BRICS nations, and it runs in parallel to the UN in the sense that these are countries that historically had no desire or need to cooperate, and are now coming together to form this alliance that is basically counterbalancing the Western powers. They're about to meet right after the United Nations. um, can you talk a little bit about that and how those 2 kind of connect or whether they do?
Yeah, I think they do connect. In fact, I will say this, that I think there are a lot of people in the independent media space, the truth movement, freedom movement, whatever you want to say, just people searching for truth, who are, I believe, falling for the deception that the BRICS nations are somehow going to save us from the Western world order. Because, for those who don't know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then there's many other nations, including Mexico, where I'm at now, who are interested in applying to be a part of the BRICS nations. And so we have this sort of interpretation that, and they like to use the term multipolar order. So people interpret that as, okay, we're going to go from the Western world order of the US and UK and Western Europe, um, essentially controlled United Nations, one world order, to this multipolar order. And, these other nations are going to be a little bit more, they're going to be a little bit more in our interest and in our goals in terms of independence and stuff like that. I don't buy that for 1 second. I'm sure they definitely can act as a counterbalance in terms of the language and the words they use. But when you really get down to looking at what the Sustainable Development Goals call for, and you look at the larger technocratic agenda, I mean, China is pretty far advanced in their technocratic agenda with social credit scores and digital IDs and facial recognition cameras and, a tight control over their population. Russia, for all the hysteria that the Western world has been told, much of it's not true. But that doesn't mean they're this bastion of liberty either, or that they're just going to respect individual liberty. I think we can look and see that most of these countries, if not all of them, are on board with things like the central bank digital currencies, with digital identities.
Yeah.
And so I definitely think that it's important for us to watch and kind of see what happens there. But ultimately, again, I haven't seen anything from Russia or China speaking out against the Summit of the Future or the Pact for the Future or the Declaration of Planetary Emergency. I could be wrong. Maybe I've missed it, but I've been following this pretty closely. And I will be interested to see how those nations react or respond at the Summit of the Future and what moves they make and whether or not it ends up going the way that I think it is going to go. And yes, absolutely, we should be watching the BRICS meeting afterwards as well. So I think that keeping an eye on what takes place there is important. But I think there is this illusion being promoted that they are somehow going to be the alternative. I've seen this even in the last week with Russia announcing that they're welcoming immigrants who have want a traditional lifestyle to come to Russia and things like that. So on the surface, they seem to be playing a role of like, we're the alternative to the craziness of the West and the neocons and the World Economic Forum and things like that. I personally don't buy that. I think that we should be very careful about accepting such narratives.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Why do you think there is so little public awareness about this or debate about it? Is it simply because the mainstream media doesn't talk about it, or is there something else going on?
I honestly don't know. I mean, like I said, I've been covering this for a year and a half. I've written about half a dozen articles on it and done numerous video reports. I am grateful to you and others who have interviewed me and brought me on to talk about it. And I will say that finally some bigger platforms are starting to reach out and want to know more about this. Of course, we're about 30 days away from it, so it's not like there's much opportunity to sort of rally against it. But I think that it's just, there's so much going on in the world, and of course there is on any day of the week. There's a million things happening, and there's also a U.S. election taking place that is sucking up a lot of the air in the room. I think that's a big part of it, and to me that is honestly not as important as the Summit of the Future. Now, of course, whatever happens in the U.S. election does impact the world, and we should pay attention to that to some degree. But if this Summit of the Future goes forward as we're expecting, and all signs point to them signing the Pact for the Future,
Right.
then whoever becomes president of the US, and there's elections taking place all over the world this year. I think they said is the biggest year for elections in history, at least in some time. Each of those new incoming presidents or prime ministers people should be putting their feet to the fire and asking them, what do you think about the Summit of the Future? What do you think about the Pact for the Future? Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on the idea of the planetary emergency? I think those are conversations that the independent media need to be asking more. We need to be discussing this. As I said, I'm grateful that finally some people are starting to pay attention. I can't claim that I have any evidence for there being some sort of operation to keep people from paying attention to this. I also think people are exhausted. I mean, so much energy went into the world, to the WHO treaty.
Yeah.
People went to Geneva and rallied, and I have friends who are involved in the organizing of that, and it's great to see. I'm grateful for that. But what is the quote? The fight for liberty is, it's an eternal vigilance. It's constant battle, right? So we let go of one thing, and well, here's the next one, right? And so the Summit of the Future is coming up. I hope more people will pay attention to it. I do want to mention that I'm still having conversations, including later today. There are some of us who are planning to have a presence in New York City. I don't know if that's going to be a protest, a rally, or just as journalists trying to go there. And, if Klaus Schwab's there, if some of these officials are putting these officials on the record. So there is still the potential for that. So just in case anybody is interested or lives in New York City and wants to get involved, or if anybody who would want to travel, whether activists or journalists, they can feel free to reach out to me at derrick@theconsciousresistance.com and see if we can organize something. I definitely think that those efforts are at least worth being there and expressing our voices. That doesn't mean we're going to prevent the signing of this document per se, but it to me personally, it would feel unfortunate if such an event passes with no public resistance, and I hope that we can at least kind of rally in that way. And perhaps online, people can, continue to spread interviews like this and spread the word. And if we have a moment, I'd also like to share, that myself and some other activists are organizing sort of a counter event to try to provide real solutions.
Yeah, please. I was going to ask you about that. Is that the People's Reset?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
please talk about that.
yeah, thank you. So in the summer of 2020, when all the COVID insanity was going on, myself and some other friends and activists, we were looking around at the freedom space. And this was, you got to remember, June 2020, the World Economic Forum announces the Great Reset, and those videos start going viral and people start flipping out. I think a lot of people were palpably feeling the fear. Lockdowns were taking place. The World Economic Forum's talking about we're going to own nothing and be happy. They're predicting digital passports and all the things that we ended up seeing. And we came together and said, what can we do to try to provide some sense of hope, real, actual, tangible hope and practical solutions. And this evolved into being what was at the time known as the Greater Reset. And we decided, let's meet at the same time as the World Economic Forum. They meet every January in Switzerland. We met for 5 days, the same 5 days they met. And at that time, of course, it was lockdown. So I had a small event here in Mexico. We had about 80 to 90 people show up, which was surprising considering the state of travel at the time. And we had 100,000 people tune in online. And we really just tapped into something. We could tell like people need this right now. We had 5 days of focusing on solutions. So we talked about mental, physical, spiritual health. We talked about permaculture and growing your own food. We talked about decentralized technology, privacy-based technology. We talked about building parallel systems like educational models and things of that sort. And then we also talked about community building tools, everything from buying land to just how to organize your activist group. And it was, we had an amazing response. And it has essentially evolved into now a worldwide movement. And so we held 5 events between January 2021 and January of this year, 2024. We sort of kind of wrapped up this trajectory that we were on, and the Greater Reset 5 took place in Texas and Mexico. We started, after the first one, we started doing live events, both a live event in Texas and a live event in Mexico with speakers and audience in both places, streamed across the world to each other and then out in the public. And when the technical aspects of it worked, it was amazing. And sometimes it was a challenge, but ultimately we've decided to continue. We've since rebranded it now as the People's Reset to sort of move the focus away from them and what they're doing, but obviously still trying to provide an alternative to their technocratic future and their technocratic vision of 2030. And instead we focus on solutions from the bottom up, from the grassroots. And so the weekend after the Summit of the Future in New York City, we're hosting our first event in the UK in Bath, UK. It's going to be the 27th to the 29th. So again, the Summit of the Future is going to be the weekend before. We're meeting Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The same 5 themes. We're bringing 24 speakers. Some we're bringing from North America, and then most of them are coming from the UK and Europe. And it's an in-person event that people can still, tickets are still available. But as with all of our previous events, we stream the entire event for free. We post all of the talks online for free. People can go visit our Odyssey channel. If you go to thegreaterreset.org or thepeoplesreset.org, they go to the same place, and you can see our Odyssey video channel. And we've posted every single talk from all 5 of our events over the past 4 years. That's over 150 hours of solutions focused talks, because we don't talk about debating conspiracies. We don't talk about, arguing about this or that topic. It is all 100% solutions focused, because we think that's what matters more than anything at this point. And so we're doing the same thing in the UK. As I said, people can, if you're in the UK, anybody hearing this, or if you want to make the trip, there's still the opportunity to do so. There's networking opportunities. There's going to be workshops of all different kinds of skills. And we really do want to make it like this participatory, a truly inclusive event where people can come and not only hear the main stage speakers that we're curating, but also come and share their own skills, their own ideas, their own services that they have. And I mean, I can honestly say it's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I encourage people to go to our Odyssey channel and to watch some of the little mini documentaries that we've made from the last couple of events. They're about 20, 30 minutes long, and it gives you just a sample of what we are creating. And so I just want to invite people, whether or not you can make it in person, to tune in online, get some friends. We encourage people to host watch parties, figure out which day and which themes apply most to you currently in your life, and focus on those solutions and take notes and start to implement them in your life, because I think that is what it's really going to take. These technocrats are going to continue to march forward and focus on their agendas, and they do impact us. But if we start to redirect our energy to what we can do for ourselves, and if each of us do that from Mexico to the US to UK and beyond, then we will see real change, because we're at a very crucial moment right now. I mean, even as we're preparing for this event, I'm sure people have been seeing the craziness going on in the UK. People are being arrested for posting on social media. Journalists are being arrested. And to me, this is exactly why we need to be there, because the places that are sometimes the most authoritarian, that's the places that need the message the most. So again, the website's thegreaterreset.org. And I hope people will check it out.
It's great. It's very inspiring, very much in line with what we try to do here at Collapse Life as well. And I think that the bottom line is just let's control what we can and not worry about the
Absolutely.
things that we can't control. So, amen. I'm really happy to hear of everything you're doing. Before we let you go, just remind people how they can follow you and learn more about you and your work.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me on and for the opportunity to speak to your audience. My main website is theconsciousresistance.com. It's called the Conscious Resistance Network. This is where I've been hosting my content for the last 12 years or so. My books are there, my documentaries, all my podcasts, my interviews, everything's available for free. In terms of solutions, I would encourage people to download or pick up a copy of my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. You can get that at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. It's available in Spanish, French, German, and of course English. There's an audiobook available for free as well, and it focuses on many of these same solutions that we try to highlight with the People's Reset.
Fantastic. Derrick, thank you so much. I hope that we can stay in touch and see how we can collaborate in future.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. I'd love to connect more with you guys.
Thank you so much. We're so lucky to have guests like Derrick come on and share their perspectives. And we're also so grateful to viewers like you for being here and showing us your support. If you haven't already, please go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you can be the first to hear about all our latest updates. Collapse Life is here to help open eyes and give people tools to take back control of their lives. We're on Substack at collapselife.substack.com. We put out news stories there every week. We're also on X at collapse_life. And we have a little store, collapselife.com. So please check out the products there and then head back here next week. We'll have another amazing guest and we look forward to seeing you. Until then, keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.